Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming tonight to the Center for Architecture and Design for the show that we've been working on for, gosh, 6 months, 8 months now. So this is very exciting to see this finally come to fruition, and we're so excited to have our colleagues here from Oklahoma and to Hans for making this come together. So thank you all. I want to introduce Marcio Piscitelli. Did I do that right? Piscitelli. Piscitelli. Is an architect. I found out I was doing the introduction like 3 minutes ago. Uh, he is an architect and an architecture teacher scholar at the California Polytechnic University. As a Herb Green teaching fellow at the University of Oklahoma, Marcio was the first researcher to explore the archive of Mickey Muning at OU. His work has been supported by the Graham Foundation, and he holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Syracuse University and a Master's from Columbia University. Marcio is the lead curator of Do Not Try to Remember, the American School of Architecture in the Bay Area. So thank you all for coming, and we'll get going now. Thanks.
Hello, all. Thanks for being here today. First, I want to start by thanking our many partners and supporters. The staff of the AIA Center for Architecture and Design has been so patient and supportive throughout this journey, so thank you so much. We're also so grateful to Hans Baldauf and BCV Architects, who really spearheaded this collaboration with the AIA San Francisco. We're also grateful for our incredible students, colleagues, and staff at the University of Oklahoma who have been working on the American School Project since 2017. The exhibition opening tonight draws on the work of a team of curators including Hans Baldauf, Christopher Lufs, Rachel Engler, Amber Sarmiento, Angela Pearson, and Stephanie Pilat. This project would not have been possible without the support of the Goff Chair of Creative Architecture and OU's Vice President of Research and Partnerships. Thank you so much. To the OU Libraries team, who created the American School Archive and who have been a steadfast partner from the start, we offer our deepest gratitude. Friends, family members, and admirers of these architects have been instrumental in helping to save and preserve their legacy. Katie Song saved the work of John Marsh Davis. Michelle Munig ensured the work of Mickey was preserved. Lisa Whitaker, Lila Cohen, the Friends of Kebyar, and so many others, we cannot thank you enough. Sherry Faust has ensured the legacy of the American School will live on through her generosity. Finally, we must recognize the architects of the American School, including locals like Donald MacDonald and Herb Green for their marvelous work. It is an honor to celebrate it here tonight. The American School story begins with Bruce Goff. In post-war America, Goff was an outlier. Charles Jenks may have put it best when he said, quote, "Goff is so extreme that he makes the rest of the avant-garde look like a bunch of prep school conformists wearing the same school tie." The Lavender House here is one of his projects in Mississippi. At a moment when architects and schools were embracing the international modernism of the Bauhaus, Goff was a renegade, clearly. Goff got his start in practice at age 12 as an apprentice in Tulsa, Oklahoma. By his early 20s, he was already designing major buildings. But it was his experience in World War II that catalyzed a shift towards a more mature style. Goff enlisted in the Navy Seabees during the war, a construction battalion. He was charged with designing military structures out of available materials, which could be built quickly and affordably. At the Camp Parks Navy base in California, Goff was challenged to design a new chapel using affordable and available materials, primarily brick, plywood, and Quonset hut structures. These materials were scarce during the war effort, so Goff used these Quonset huts as structural systems. And if you don't know, these are typically used to quickly enclose spaces for barracks and warehouses. Here, the structure instead creates a wide open barrel vault for this non-denominational worship space. Goff viewed the budget and labor constraints as a challenge and as a springboard for creativity. The project was designed and built quickly. It opened a year after Goff arrived on the base. How impressive. This chapel was praised by architects and religious leaders alike and published nationally. Architectural Forum, seen here, ran a 6-page article in December of 45, lauding the design for the imaginative but highly unorthodox solution. Later, writing an architectural design, critic Lionel March captured the power of Goff's invention here at Camp Parks. I quote, "The Quonset hut system, consisting of curved, corrugated metal shell, was ubiquitous throughout the Western Hemisphere during the Second World War. The semi-cylindrical form spotted the landscape like some poxy infection. Goff takes this system, fit in the popular mind only for the scrap heap, and transforms it into a place of worship. This is a symbolic act, a religious statement profounder than all of the art in Coventry." The publicity surrounding the chapel at Camp Parks brought Goff to the attention of the faculty at the University of Oklahoma, where they were searching for new leadership. Despite not having a college degree, Goff was hired and elected chairman of the architecture school in 1947. After he arrived at OU, Goff recruited an impressive group of faculty, including Mendel Glickman, most well known as Frank Lloyd Wright's structural engineer, as well as Elizabeth Mock, Fay Jones, and others. These renegades, as we've come to call them, promoted a radical approach to teaching design, centered on contextualism, resourcefulness, and experimentation. This was a major departure from what other schools were doing at the time. Around the mid-century, most architecture schools in the United States followed a curriculum inspired either by the French Beaux-Arts or the German Bauhaus. Here you see an example of the Beaux-Arts curriculum. Students learned through the study and drawing of neoclassical architecture. By the post-war era, many schools had turned to the Bauhaus model of architectural education. Here you see Mies van der Rohe, a Bauhaus leader at IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, where he led the school. You can see the building on the left. It looks just like an imitation of Mies van der Rohe's work. It's like the Farnsworth house, just stretched out, right? When Goff arrived at OU, the School of Architecture was housed at an old Navy barracks. Bill Haney, an OU alum, described what it was like to arrive at this strange school in the 1940s. Finding the School of Architecture in a former Navy barracks north of the city, I walked into a mysterious and fascinating space. The ceiling and walls were painted flat black, and display surfaces were black Celotex insulation boards mounted on the backs of freestanding bookcases. Corners and columns were rhythmically dotted with white circular tabs used to reinforce holes punched in those leaf binder pages. Overhead was stretched closely spaced parallel strands of white strings. With these mundane and inane elements, a spectacular sense of space was achieved by an imagination I had not encountered before. To my right and slightly behind me was an opening, arrayed with dime store hanging beads, providing a colorful element of semi-privacy. Quietly parting the beads appeared Bruce Goff, extending a hand and a warm welcome in a soft voice with a slight Oklahoma drawl. I was immediately set at ease. Once students enrolled, they were taught to avoid imitation of any kind. The faculty at OU believed the job of an educator was to draw out the individual creativity of each student. They didn't teach a style. Students developed a keen awareness of global architecture history, but when they arrived in the design studio, they were instructed, do not try to remember. Do not begin with classical column capitals. Do not begin with proportional systems or modernist grids. Do not begin by imitating the designs of your instructor. Do not arrive at the beginning with an end already in mind. Instead, begin fresh. Begin with the natural context, the slope of the land, the quality of the light, local building materials. Be earnest in responding to program. Sincerely listen to the needs and desires of the client. Most importantly, begin by trusting your own creative instincts. At the time, this was really radical. To understand just how different the OU student approach was, we can look at a 1957 publication called NASA. It included student work from 52 American architecture schools. Each school was given a 2-page spread in the book to share student work. Here you see student work from Harvard. We might describe it as boxes of all kinds. Vertical boxes forming skyscrapers, horizontal boxes with rectilinear courtyards carved out of them. We have more boxes at Virginia Tech, flat roofs, ribbon windows, even a whole series of these shoeboxes carpeting a hillside. Here is IIT, student work where Mies van der Rohe led the school. Here we have Miesian boxes, slightly different than the other boxes, broken apart into planes and lines. Looking at all this boxy work, it does seem like, quote, a bunch of prep school conformists wearing the same school tie. And then there was OU. Otherworldly, dramatic, organic visions. No boxes to be found here. The goal at OU was, after all, originality. Imitation was the only thing off limits. Some of these renegade architects educated in Oklahoma migrated to the San Francisco Bay Area after graduation. Do Not Try to Remember showcases the work of these architects. I'd like to start by sharing some examples of this student work from the 1950s, just to give you a sense of how these architects got started at OU. Because it wasn't just the work at the NASA publication that was widely creative and original. Here, for example, we see a design for an Institute of Mathematical Research that John Marsh Davis completed as a student at OU. It's unlike anything we've seen before. Here we see some more work from John Marsh Davis. Comfort stations, basically restrooms at a golf course, composed by these strange, rhythmic, stacked Lincoln logs, articulated with strange finials, and of course rendered in this immersive, almost fairy tale setting. We have Robert Faust in a composition called Architectural Character from 1953. Compositions of color and light and shadow, abstract and yet strangely immersive. We have Herb Green, the composition entitled Air. Here we see a weightless, floating assemblage of folded lines, planes, of course, a ground plane, nevertheless. Mickey Munig, some of the work we'll see here today. These are two works from his previous, from his two student works from him. Kind of strange references to American indigenous forms, perhaps strange references to vernacular building construction as well. Donald MacDonald's student work. This is a preschool for the US Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. I mean, this could be Zaha Hadid in the 21st century. Valentino Agnoli's work, some truly fascinating compositions. This chiaroscuro, this contrapposto, these compositions truly baffle the mind. Richard Whitaker's work. This is a neighborhood recreation center. It's always these banal names and these fantastical forms. And of course, not just architecture, we have an example of Violetta Autumn's chair, one of my favorites in the exhibition. So, do not try to remember. The American School of Architecture in the Bay Area explores this work, the work of a group of Oklahoma graduates who went west and established groundbreaking practices here. Educated in the American school approach developed by Bruce Goff, free of European dogma, these architects, we call renegades, iconoclasts, apostates even, were taught to prize originality and individual creativity. Here in California, they found clients and society open to these creative visions. They helped shape the communities and the built environment of the region. So we're going to now turn to our panel discussion. First, I want to note that we have many friends and family of these architects here tonight, and we want to hear from all you too. So after this panel, we'll invite some of you, audience members, to share a brief story or a recollection about these architects. I know many of you have known them in person. We're eager to hear from you, eager to hear how your lives have been transformed by these groups of renegades. It's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists today. Hans Baldauf, FAIA, is a founding principal of BCV Architecture and Interiors. Mr. Baldauf's interest in the public realm has led BCV to pursue a wide variety of project types, which at their core enrich civic lives. He has taught architecture at Yale University, the University of Illinois Chicago, and Notre Dame. He has been instrumental in saving and celebrating the legacy of John Marsh Davis. He is the author of The Design Legacy of John Marsh Davis, which you should take a look at outside. Angela Pearson, PhD, is an associate dean at the University of Oklahoma. Her award-winning scholarship explores intersections of design, community, identity, heritage, and sustainability. Pearson co-curated the recent Outre West exhibition, from which Do Not Try to Remember draws. She co-edited both the Outre West and Renegades catalogs, both of which are also outside. You should take a look. Stephanie Pilat, PhD, is a professor of architecture at the University of Oklahoma as well. She is a designer and architectural historian whose teaching and research examines points of intersection between politics and architecture. She was a co-curator of Outre West and co-edited both the Outre West and Renegades catalogs. Thanks so much. Ready? So I'm just going to ask a couple simple questions to our panel today, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say. First, what is one project you suggest visitors take a close look at, and why? Who wants to go first?
Here, I think it is now. The Bavinger House by Bruce Goff at the very beginning of the house and Herb Green's Prairie House are paired right next to each other. And what I think is so remarkable about these two projects and will lead you into the rest of the exhibition is that one thinks of the prairie as this very flat place without a lot of landscape. And these houses milk the landscape from the prairie and are simultaneously engaged with the landscape and create landscape. And I think that when you look at the work of these architects that came from Oklahoma to California, they had the benefit of California's landscape to interact with. And you only need to look at Donald, who's sitting here right in front of me's Bay Bridge, to see the wonderful arc of those cables and how they relate to the Oakland Hills and have transformed our everyday experience of San Francisco through that bridge, through that interaction with landscape. And so if you look at the Bavinger House and you think about the Bay Bridge and you draw the connection, I think you'll find it to be a very rich one. And I think you'll see it in every one of the architects that are in this exhibition, that engagement with landscape and the creation of landscape at the same time.
I think that's really beautifully said, Hans. And just to piggyback off of that a little bit, the Bavinger House and the Prairie House, which is shown next to it, right at the start of the exhibition, both of them have been in place for a long time. The Bavinger, unfortunately, is not there any longer, but the landscape also continued to evolve and grow up around these buildings, and so they really feel stitched and knitted in to the site. And I think that it's almost like the architects had that sort of foresight, which is really neat. My sort of favorite part that I hope you don't miss is there's some construction photographs woven through. So pay close attention to those. And I think that they really highlight quite nicely how the architects worked with the contractors. These projects, these wild, imaginative projects would never have been possible without those close relationships that the architects made with the builders through, in some cases, decades, in some cases through generations. And so I just invite you, as you look at each of the projects, to consider what sorts of relationships were necessary in order to bring these really creative, unique works into the world.
Yes, it didn't just take the genius of one architect. It really did take incredible clients and builders as well. I would encourage you to look at the student work. Marco just showed us some of the examples, and I would say take a closer look at those, because the goal of the American School really was to elicit creativity from students. And if you went to architecture school, that probably wasn't the goal. Like, I know I'm a graduate of Cincinnati, and certainly it was still sort of Bauhaus inspired. And I think that student work really shows us how different the Oklahoma attitude was. And it now is something I think we take for granted in other arts, like in music. You would never go to music school to just imitate your teacher. You wouldn't go to cooking school to be a line cook and just use your teacher's recipes, right? Like, you go to cooking school because you want to be a chef and you want to invent your own recipes and test out new mixes of ingredients. But architecture school has not caught up with that idea. So for really centuries, we've been teaching students to follow the recipes of their instructors. And there's good reason for that, because it's expensive to build. And if you build experimentally, there are a lot of things that could go wrong, including like people's lives are at risk. There's a lot of money, there are building codes. And so teaching students to imitate stuff that has already been done is a much safer route. And that's what you see in most architecture schools. But I think we could ask our students to do better than that. And I think our job as educators is to really figure out how to walk that line and teach students to develop their own creativity within the constraints of building real buildings. And that's what you see in those construction photographs, is like, it still has to be buildable, it has to stand up, it has to be waterproof, and all of those things as well.
And if I were to answer my own question, I would urge you to not miss Donald MacDonald's urban work towards the back. So much of the work you'll see here, beautiful landscapes, small bespoke homes. But the question that's always in the back of my mind as I research the work of the American School, this pedagogy, this strange approach to architecture, right, is how do you tackle the challenges of the city? How do you build within challenging urban sites, especially, a couple decades ago when the future of the cities in America was uncertain? And I think the big question that I have as an architect approaching this is, how can we ask how to work like an American school architect in multifamily, right? Infrastructure projects even, right? How can you approach the landscape of the city with the same sensitivity that, say, Mickey Munich took to his pristine coastlines, right? So that's one of my answers to my own questions. Okay, next question. What do you hope visitors take from the work of the American School architects into their own lives and their own work? I'm sure we have plenty of architects in the audience today.
So in thinking about this question, I sort of go back to what Stephanie said about challenging students and creating an environment that gets the kind of creativity out of students that this group of architects clearly shows. And I think it's wonderfully interesting to realize that there's I think, an encouragement to dare that is really important. And I look at John Marsh Davis's approach to life was that he was always daring everything, it feels like, and that he didn't even become a registered architect because I think it was so, in a way, part of joining that prep school. It was like, it was more interesting to grow giant hedges around properties and then do everything illegally. And that actually had a kind of outre behavior that was really important. But I think it allowed that he created his own projects. He developed his own projects. He didn't wait around for the client. He would build a house and sell it. Donald didn't wait around for the redevelopment agency to solve housing problems. He went and bought city lots, subdivided them, and built 50 years ago micro housing. And we're talking about it now like it's a discovery. And I think that it's daring, inculcating and supporting ourselves, our culture, in a daring mentality to not just wait for other people to say it's okay to do something. It's to just go do it.
I completely agree. And so I think my answer is basically the same, but in different words. They exercised their agency and still are, to the fullest. They're not thinking like, oh, it's difficult to build on the coast of Big Sur, or it's very expensive to do urban infill for single family residences. These folks really had big ideas and then have brought them into the world. And so it's so special to be able to see all of these projects on the walls out there that are built works that came, yes, as a result of the many relationships and thinking really creatively, and in some cases growing really tall hedges. But they really did everything that they needed to do to bring these works into the world. And so I think there's so much that each of us can learn from these projects, because it's not just in those folks who studied with Bruce Goff. There's so much learning that we can all do and carry with us into our own lives. And I hope you will.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, but maybe go backwards a little bit. So how do we create an environment in which students or any of us really develop the courage to have that daring? That's something we've been researching as we explore this history. And when you think about architecture school, for those of you who endured it, it's usually understood as a very grueling environment. You know, you pin your work up publicly, the faculty are cruel, they might tear apart your models, there might be people crying. That was not the case at OU at all under Goff. And I think we have so much to learn from that. So he didn't believe in the crit system as we know it, where you pin up your work and you get kind of scolded and demeaned by faculty and students. So he believed that if you were going to have courage as an artist to be daring, you really needed a supportive environment, and you needed to develop your own sense of self-critique. And perhaps your fellow students, because they're going through it with you, can be a bit critical of your work, but faculty should never be coming in and tearing apart your work. They should be encouraging you to keep going and creating a really supportive learning environment. And now, today, scholars of teaching and learning would say, yeah, of course, students learn better when you have a supportive learning environment. It's like, it seems so obvious, and yet I would bet that half the architecture schools in this country haven't figured that out yet. And so I guess the thing I would say, like, to take with you today is whether you're trying to get your kid to be courageous in art or filmmaking or music, or whether you're trying to develop your own skills in a new area, like supportive environments are going to help you be daring and courageous and take risks. And those harshly critical negative ones really aren't going to do it. And the proof is on the walls out there.
That's so beautifully put. Well, I would like to hear some questions from all of you, because I bet there's some good ones in the audience, and our panel would love to engage with any of them. Does anyone have any questions?
So we were talking earlier about like the time that some of these buildings were built and about like materials and what was available. So when we were in Oklahoma and we got to see some of Goff's buildings and like, you know, the crazy glass, plastic, you know, lights that were coming in. And my uncle, John Marsh Davis, used to build a lot with like redwood, but now it's like so expensive. So like how do new architects, I mean, how does like the change in the economy and like the landscape impact how and what you build?
Well, I think it's a really fantastic question, and it's hard to, it's hard for anything to compare to that old growth redwood that Marsh Davis was working with in the 60s, 70s, right? But I think a lot of the spirit of the American school architects can come from the off the rack, the off the shelf. They can come from the cheap, the reused, the salvaged even. I mean, with this exhibition here, we're using off the rack, you know, galvanized studs, right? That will eventually have another life in a building somewhere, probably, right? So I actually find the most inspiration not necessarily in that lovely, sensuous tactility that comes from some of this incredibly beautiful work, of course, right? But where the architects have used the local even. So in Munich's work, you might say, I mean, beautiful craft, of course, a deep connection to the landscape, um, completely unique relationships to his own builders even. But so much of the material was found on site, like some of this old limestone he just carves from the earth to erect a wall. Even in Post Ranch Inn, a lot of that is from recycled railroad ties that came down in the, I guess, 30s after they built Highway 1. So that's part of the way I would get into that question. What do you guys think?
I think in a related vein, they were great at transmogrification, like the idea that you find a material that could be totally mundane. And in Goff's case, he's really famous for just buying literally as many dime store ashtrays as he could and then embedding them in a wall. And they're kind of faceted and they really glimmer in different lighting settings. And so it's incredible to see how they do that with just like literally the cheapest materials.
So I'm going to keep picking on Donald because he's sitting right here. But, you know, it was wonderful at the exhibition in Oklahoma. The students built one of Donald's city sleepers, which was a project he did for housing the homeless that was made out of how many sheets of plywood? 4 sheets of plywood, 6 sheets of plywood. Okay, so 6 sheets of plywood. And Donald spends as much time talking about that as the billions of dollars that he plays with when he's doing these bridges he's doing right now. And I think it's really, I mean, it's in a way not the budget, it's the creativity that addresses the problem. And if there are all sorts of bridges that are far less beautiful that are built every day, but in the hands of someone who actually knows what they're doing and can think about how to make them beautiful. It's why my son like wears his Warriors jersey that has a Donald bridge on it. You know, it's an amazing thing. You can turn an ordinary thing that happens to cost a lot of money into something that becomes a basketball logo. Crazy.
Yeah. I'll add just one example. As I was listening to you all talking, and I was trying to think like what architects in Oklahoma are doing today with regard to this question, like how do you look around at the landscape? And we do have a colleague, Amy Laveno, who's doing incredible work. We grow a lot of pot in Oklahoma. For some reason, it's not highly regulated. And so she is taking the waste product from that to make hempcrete blocks and build from that. And to us, it seems very much like, oh yeah, that's the American school. Like look around the landscape, what's going on and how do you take something from it and be resourceful and create buildings from it. And so that's a great example, I think.
Other questions? Hold on, I want to run over. We have some folks in other rooms. They want to hear you too.
Oh, just so you brought it up, I wasn't going to, but since you mentioned pot, how was that an influence? Were they users of pot or were they just children of like space age? I mean, a lot of it feels very psychedelic. So you do look at it and you go like, huh, I wonder
Should
if
we take a vote? Who thinks they did? Raise your hands if you think they did. Who thinks it wasn't pot, but it was something else? What if we tell you no? Yeah.
Well.
Oh, except for Munich, maybe later. I don't know. Maybe
Well, I
not.
think it's important to recognize that, you know, architects like Mickey Munich were part of this countercultural movement, you know, late 60s, early 70s. Big Sur. I mean, you can use your imagination here.
But I will say Goff didn't drink or smoke or drive. He was pretty like, and it like, if you hear him recorded, he sounds very like low key Midwestern. Yeah, he dressed flamboyantly. So that was like a little bit more expressive, but otherwise, yeah, I don't think he engaged in any of that, but Mickey Munich is a different story.
They would get together and listen to music and draw while they listen to music. And so they, you know, they use that as one outlet. But yeah, to our understanding, it was not a big part of the school culture.
Yeah, I mean, you have to imagine that part of Goff's pedagogy was having his students sit in a dark room and just listen. I mean, that's pretty groovy.
Congratulations, first of all, on this is really magnificent. I'm so curious, when the alums moved out here, did you track each other's work and keep in touch or at all?
Great question.
I think we hand it
Yeah,
to Donald.
I mean, please, do minds?
I didn't think I'd get involved in this one. No, what happened when I came out here, one of the reasons I did come here, I got a teaching job at Berkeley, but I worked with John Davis for about 3 years. And that was a nice introduction for me to, you know, in the West Coast, because I'd been from Canada to Oklahoma to New York. I went to Columbia and then I came to Oklahoma. I mean, came out to California. And so it was a really good background. And I did have an attitude that, and some of my old friends are here could back it up, where I looked at the client, needs of the land. I didn't look at, you know, anybody else. I just wanted to solve the problem. In all my design years, I've gone from furniture to bridges, Christ, everything in between, you know. And so I'm just saying that Oklahoma gave me that ability, and it was brought up by Stephanie, that you had to get into yourself and work with your creative process and get good people around you that work with you. So I've had a really good life that way, and I've done a ton of bridges and all over North America and stuff. It's just amazing what I got out of that school. And I did mention one thing to these people a while ago, is that I happened to study under Mendel Glickman, who had done Frank Lloyd Wright work, and I had a great structural background from him. Then I went to Columbia and I studied under Mario Salvadori, another great guy, and he did work with Weidlinger, which I worked with on the Bay. But anyhow, the point is that background in engineering, and most people don't realize when we were at school, the architecture department was part of the engineering department. We had a thermodynamics and physics. And half the class dropped out at the second year because you just couldn't handle it. So that was really unique. And I don't know if it's like that today, but we had a really big background in structural engineering. And the oddball thing is an honor student in engineering, which is a bloody riot. Thanks a lot.
So,
I-
but Donald, I think the interesting question that was, I feel like in hearing about you all, there is a sort of Oklahoma mafia
Yeah.
of you guys who somehow supported each other, and not just guys. Violetta was part of it. I mean, that somehow there was an interesting, I mean, as I understand it, there's the famous trope of the Dust Bowl emigration from California to Oklahoma and the Okies, and there's a lot of prejudice against that. But there was a second migration after World War II of people from the Midwest to California for the opportunity, and yet those people retain their connections. And so I think there really was a community of sorts, but you can comment whether I'm
Yeah, Richard Whitmire, yeah, I guess Whitaker, I'm sorry, was really talented. He was in the city and he worked with John Davis. Violetta Autumn worked with him. And Dyson, who's in Fresno, and I don't see his work here at the moment, but he did a ton of work. I knew him and I talked at one of his conferences with him and all that, but there was a real network when I came. And the reason was that to find people that were solving the problems, and then I'd learn the techniques. And like with John Davis, in fact, there's a drawing I did in there for him. It's an axometric. That's my drawing. and I tried to get from Kate, but it never happened. But the point I'm getting is that there was a basis here we could work from, and it was an understanding. But what's interesting, and that's where it was brought up earlier, that in the urban spaces, it's much more difficult to do something unique because there's planning codes, and the planning codes have building envelopes, and you can't horse around. Whereas you work outside the city, it's a lot easier to be organic in that. And here I won't say it's tough, but it's a different kind of problem. And as most of these guys here that know me, I spend a lot of my time solving urban problems. In fact, one person just mentioned to me that I did one of the first condominiums in the city, which was kind of interesting. I forgot about that. And I had to buy the land and do it myself because nobody else would do it. But I had friends that had money. I did use that. And so that's been part of the Oklahoma background. If nobody will do it, well, I'll work it out myself and I'll try to solve their problem and use the creative process. So that was kind of my background.
But you also did exhibitions of all of your fellow designers, even in Europe, from here. So do you want to mention that quickly?
Comment on that. I'm actually the one that coined the phrase the American School of Architecture. And I was asked by a guy that I knew in London, because I went there quite often, if I would like to do a show about architects on the West Coast. And then his last name was Harris, and he's at the RIBAs. He ran their exhibition. I said, I could put something together back in the 80s, I guess. And so I found a bunch of guys that had gone to Oklahoma, put it together, and it was a big show in London. And in fact, the American ambassador came and opened the show. There's some American festival at the time. And it carried on, and I thought Oklahoma would pick it up, but they was a little slowing doing that. And Hans Butzer came along, grabbed it. Good move, because it is a unique way of learning. And it was very important for a guy like me who'd come from Canada and had some background in architecture. I'd worked a couple of years with an architect. They told me I need to go back to school, so I did. So I ended up in Oklahoma. But the point I'm making again is it was a creative process. We never had juries. I go to Columbia and we had juries, And when I was teaching at Berkeley, we did juries. And I always felt that backing you guys up, that juries weren't great when the guy's learning. Be positive, let it build on that. And that's what Oklahoma had done for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Do we have any other questions for our panel? Yeah.
Hi, we saw a lot of envelopes, new shapes, and a connection between the interior and the exterior. I saw a floor plan that mentioned the word hearth. And so some spaces from the past were retained. I'm curious if there were new spaces interior that were created for living.
Fantastic question. Okay. Well, I might answer some of that because part of what makes I think Mickey Munich's work so enigmatic and perhaps so revolutionary is that the enclosure becomes indistinct. Of course, in Big Sur, and there are other places in California where that enclosure doesn't have to be as robust as perhaps other climates, but it really allows for a new understanding, a new reading of that transition between inside and outside. And there's a couple works by him on display here today that even start to question not just that distinction between inside and outside, but even perhaps who the house is for. Is this for a man, or is it for, an olive tree, right? That's planted in the middle of a living room, right? Who's living in this house? And I think the focus on the enclosure dissolving is perhaps one of the most radical proposals among these architects. What do you folks think?
I totally agree. And I'm thinking about the Ford House, which is not in the show, but I hope you'll all Google it. This is a Bruce Goff project that's in Illinois. And it has this very large plant. It's, I don't know, is it 15 feet tall? The roots grow down through the foundation of the building and out into, like, it's probably taking up the whole yard, maybe adjacent lots. And so it's just a really beautiful example of how there really is this intense blurring of boundaries for that home and many of these projects.
Yeah, I mean, one more is the Bavinger house. We have a couple images of it just outside. There's no rooms in the Bavinger house. It's this almost parametric spiral space, a bit like a nautilus. And rather than bedrooms, spiraling up the staircase in the middle of the house were these cantilevered bedroom pods, so to speak, which were wrapped in a kind of mesh or a net. And I think it really starts to transgress notions of privacy even and gender even. I mean, it's really, really radical. Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. What was the commercial reception to the American school? And were there other schools that were more favored by clients? And what was the tension there? And how did the members of the school get patrons to support their work?
Great question.
I feel like there's so many different ways to answer that question. And in some ways it's maybe architect specific. So maybe we could pick an architect to start with. And maybe John Marsh Davis is a good starting point.
Well, as I mentioned, John created his own work by developing his own projects. And then he famously, as Nancy Barber, one of his early clients, put it, you thought you were hiring the architect, but you were getting approved by John. And he had that ethos that he chose what he wanted to work on and how he wanted to work on it. And he walked the walk in the sense that there were periods of great economic frugality in his life, but he didn't compromise. And I think that, it's a way of living. And I think Mickey Munig, I mean, these architects are remarkable, and you hear Donald, so you can he can speak for himself, but it's that courage thing that I was talking about earlier, that you have to have the courage to do your life the way you want to do it. And I think that they all figured that out. I think that what's interesting to me, and we've talked a little bit about this, but Paul Rudolph came to Yale as the dean after Bruce Goff was chased out of the University of Oklahoma. And Rudolph actually pursued a pedagogical approach somewhat similar. I mean, it didn't give up juries and the like, but there was a kind of real emphasis under Rudolph on pluralism and students understanding that there were a lot of different ways of looking at the world. And that tradition has continued through as a thread at Yale since I was there and in the decades since. I think that there is and everyone comes through an architectural education differently. And I think that the whole point of this exhibition is about how do we educate, how do we continue to educate ourselves, and how do we inspire ourselves and the next generation. And so I think that it's a tricky thing, but I think that we always have to constantly be asking these questions.
I have a bit of a detour, but toward answering an angle of your question. So Hans mentioned that Goff was chased out of OU. So interestingly, not by the administration, not by the students, everybody there wanted him to stay, but there was a local developer that did not want him to stay. So this work is not for everyone. That said, Goff had a prolific practice. So he had over 500 projects designed, and I'm not sure how many built, but in the probably hundreds, which is pretty wild for somebody who owned his own practice and maybe had one or two drafts people sort of on staff with him at a given moment. That's wildly active for a practitioner. And so he definitely found his people who believed in his work, and he could be pretty picky about, how his projects were executed, but he still made it happen. I think all of these people, there were such strong personalities and are such strong personalities in their own ways that folks are drawn to that sort of vision.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, along with Donald, the other sort of person who comes out of this group of architects who designs and builds a ton is Art Dyson in Fresno, California. I think the number is something like 800 buildings in Fresno, California, and they are all wild, and each one is more different than the next. But then you also have some of these architects like Herb Green and Bob Faust, who went on to teach at other schools. So Herb Green taught at OU and then at Kentucky, and Bob Faust taught at Auburn for, I think, close to 40 years. And he taught at an American School seminar. And I know his students had a joke, and I'm sad I can't remember the exact phrasing, but they would mock other schools in terms of like, those schools are just, creating corporate drones that are just going to go work at the letter firms, the SOM, the HOK. Like the Faust students were very much part of the American school tradition in that they were being educated to be individuals and creative, and they didn't really want to go practice in the large corporate firms. So.
Well, we'd love to hear some more questions. We also know that we have a number of sort of friends and family, folks that worked, lived, knew, loved these fascinating individuals. So we'd love to hear some of your stories as well, if you'd like to share. Yeah.
Could you speak to global warming, the seas rising, fires, etc., and materials?
I would love to talk about that. Because I think one of the most important lessons that we can learn from this architecture, if we recognize first that these architects were trained to always respond to the site, to the way the wind moved across the site, to the local materials, to the climate, to the trees that are existing on the site. And that wasn't the case at other architecture schools. So like if you look at Mies van der Rohe's student work, you can find so many examples of the Farnsworth House, big and small, in Minnesota, in Miami. So most architecture schools in the mid-century were training architects to follow a recipe and apply it universally anywhere, right? And now, of course, we recognize that a glass box in Miami or Minnesota makes no sense at all, right, for the climate. And so I think one of the most important things that we can take away from this architecture is recognizing that site-specific contextual architecture that is resourceful is absolutely the right thing to do for our planet. And when you drive across this country and you get off at an exit in California and you get off at an exit in Nebraska and Illinois, and so much of our built landscape looks the same, and it is banal, and it is not site-specific in any way, and it has very little relationship to context. That's because all those architecture schools were teaching students to do the same thing for decades. Boxes, 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 boxes. And that's kind of a terrifying legacy, I think, to confront for us. But I do think the American school shows that there is another way possible.
I think that's completely true. And I think it's something that we all have to take on, because it's not just the architecture schools, it's also policy, it's bound up in supply chains. There's all these different factors that are pushing designers toward doing the same thing again and again. And then we end up with these huge environmental disasters. We see it in Oklahoma. We have big hailstorms, we have tornadoes very famously. And still, when a home gets re-roofed, this is happening, this year, we put the same sort of asphalt shingles on top that will have to then be re-roofed again, in a couple years, not in 10 or 15 years, as the shingles are warranted to last. And so we keep doing this again and again. And I think that these architects do show us alternate paths, but at the end of the day, it's not up to the architects alone. It's everybody who's sort of on the hook for this.
I mean, beautiful said.
I'm going to be tricky here and not answer the question, but I'm going to put a builder on the spot. I'm going to get Jim Lino, who had the privilege of working with John Marsh Davis and Violetta Autumn as a builder, come and talk a little bit about building materials and fun that he had with them, because I think it would be interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for putting me on. John,
Do
can you?
Do you want to hear?
No, I'm okay standing.
Okay.
Could be on.
John? This is on? Okay, good. Thanks for putting me on the spot, Hans. So I had the great fortune to work with both John Marsh Davis and Violetta Autumn, two of the architects that were key in the exhibition, Otra West. And thank everyone at University of Oklahoma that put that together. I went at the closing of the exhibition and was profoundly affected to see that work displayed, some of which represented about 45 years of my life. I first met Violetta Autumn in 1973, building a house of her design in Mill Valley. I first worked with Katie's uncle, John Marsh Davis, in 1979 and continued to work with him almost up to his death. I'm fortunate to live in a design by John Marsh Davis that's just extraordinary, that I built. And I think I was asked today how many of his buildings, some small, some large, but I think it's somewhere around 14 buildings of John Marsh Davis's design. So I had the opportunity to work very closely with him, including standing over him while he was drawing stuff, just trying to solve problems. The effect on my life was profound in my sensibility of design, absolutely profound. And Violetta's effect also. I built some furniture for her house in Sausalito and did some detailing for her that she wanted to change from when it was originally built in the 60s. As to materials, so the question was kind of posed on materials. I'm fortunate or unfortunate. I'm fortunate because I got to work with the last of the great Pacific Northwest woods, Douglas fir. You mentioned old growth redwood earlier. The Douglas fir is available, redwood is available, not in old growth. It's a different material. So that's changed. The climate question came up. We're living in a time of extreme fires. Most of how we continue to live that way hasn't been resolved by designers yet. It's a game of catch up. I don't want to go on too long, but I'm lucky to be here. I'm lucky to have met these people who have raised this awareness of some of these great architects. Thank you.
So no, so Jim, I'm just curious. I continue to put you on the spot. You can't run. The doors are locked. There's panic hardware, but the it's sort of, how was the creative collaboration?
Different than with other architects. So with John specifically, Violetta tended to be very precise, and working with her didn't involve a lot of conversation. With John, there was a lot of conversation, and often collaboration. There was a point in the starting in the late 80s where he was contacted by clients, and I was fortunate in that he told the clients that if they would enter into contract with me to build the house, he would start designing it. Awkward for the client. Fortunate for me. So that became a collaboration because a budget might be part of the design process, and I would be involved through iterations of design. Also, I would do mock-ups. Not everything John drew was highly detailed. Some of it open to interpretation. So mock-ups were commonly used, and a couple of clients commented that you guys just pointed a little bit and changed stuff. I don't even know what happened, but you both walked away satisfied the problem was solved. What are you going to build? And so kind of the unspoken part after years of working together was something that just happened. So I'm fortunate. I'm changed because of your uncle.
So one last thing that I would love you to say, because we were talking about it this afternoon, and I think it goes to Donald's comment about OU and structural engineering, was the stories about Violetta Autumn's engineering details, because it's sort of badass that this woman architect at a period of time that was not an architect was, I mean, talk about the detail of drilling into the rock.
Okay, so this is, I'll try and get this quickly. So early 70s, architects, then many of them in single residential buildings, were doing their own structural engineering. We have I know at least one structural engineer who I've worked with here tonight, who does the structural engineering on the projects, or many of the projects we're building. Then the architects did their own engineering. This was a house in Mill Valley. It's 1973. And she was resolving lateral resistance with shear walls and designing hold downs that are now standard. The Simpson Company has like a wild array of them. One of the hold down points at the end of a panel happened to land over hard rock on the site. It was serpentine, very difficult. The building had to be hand excavated because of its location. Anyhow, she agreed that the hold down would be set into the rock, drill into the rock. She provided a specification for attaching it to the rock. So it's kind of a fun story. I was a boy then. It was 1973. So good memory.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And once again, thank you guys.
Oh, we'll chat later. We're so glad to have you here today. Do we have any other stories, any other connections, any other questions even? We'd love to keep chatting.
I wanted to talk a little bit about quite revolutionary approach of American School of Architecture from client's perspective, because the fluidity or organicness of the architecture suggested more, I guess, different way of living. So I was curious to hear more how people embrace that in day-to-day life.
I can say a little bit about that. Maybe the best example is Art Dyson, who studied at Taliesin with Frank Lloyd Wright and then comes to Oklahoma and works with Bruce Goff. And I should say all these architects really believed that you start with the client along with the site, right? So that you design each building individually for each client. Art Dyson took that to a new level of extreme. So he created a 35-page survey that he gives to every client. He wants to know what kind of music you listen to, what your favorite color is. He wants to know, yeah, were you read to as a child in a restaurant? Where do you like to sit? You know, like it is extensive psychological interrogation, I would say. But that is really because he, like most of these architects, sincerely wanted to build something for that individual client, for that person. And I think that was really just part of the approach. So not everyone would like a given house by Goff or Dyson, but the person it was designed for, right? So that was the goal.
I think it's already on.
Hello. Yeah. It seems like most of the folks represented in this school practiced as sole practitioners. But Richard Whitaker became part of a sort of super group. And I'm just wondering if you could say something about how his, in coming from the American school, influenced what MLTW did.
You know, I should say, we started this project in 2016 and Donald has been working on it for decades. We're still learning about these architects. So I'm hoping you can tell me more about Dick Whitaker because he's one we just got his archive thanks to Hans reaching out to the family. And we honestly haven't had time to really start that work yet. Yeah.
I actually think it's a different Dick Whitaker. There are two Dick Whitakers. So no, I'm not 100% sure, but I think there are two, and so it's a different Dick Whitaker. That's correct.
Speaking of the archive, though, I do want to take a second just to share a little bit about it. It's pretty wild. We have thousands of beautiful drawings and photographs all held by OU libraries. And again, recognizing Donald, I came out and talked to Donald for several hours in 2017. It was a wonderful conversation. When I got back to Oklahoma, boxes started to arrive. And since then, it's been like Christmas consistently. Boxes coming from Donald, boxes coming from Auburn, where the Fausts were, like boxes coming from Katie, cleaning out Mickey Munich's shipping container. We had colleagues who went out and did that and drove, from Big Sur back with a U-Haul. It's been a wild adventure for nearly a decade and some of the most fun that we've had.
And all of these archives are publicly accessible. Some is digitized already, so you have to check it out. Do we have any other questions or stories you want to share? Yes, thank you so much.
So this is more about the furniture component to it. So I saw that beautiful chair that Violetta had done, and I know that my uncle custom created a lot of furniture for his places. Was that part of the American School, Donald? Like, is that like designing the furniture too as a component of the building?
Okay, I think a good example of that, if you look at a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, he did a lot of furniture. And I've done it probably near 100 pieces of do-it-yourself furniture for a major magazine like Family Circle and Sunset, House Beautiful and August, a whole bunch of them. And I think what comes out of that is problem solving. If somebody wants to sit in a chair, well, I'll design the chair. You don't need to buy one. You can build it yourself. And John Davis was sort of like that. He developed a lot of stuff, and his taste was really incredibly, because always related to the environments he was in. And he took a lot of McGuire's furniture and people like that were sensitive to what he was doing. But I felt that after looking at Frank Lloyd Wright's work and see what he had been doing, stained glass windows and all that, that there's a place for a guy like me to play with it. And I was lucky that I worked with the American Plywood Association up in Seattle, and they asked me to do what got me involved, I should back up a little, was that Family Circle had hired this guy down in Seattle who was at American Plywood to do furniture for the magazine. And he called me up and said, Donald, we need help because the stuff this guy designed, they don't like it. So I said, okay, I'll whack at it. And I think John Britton behind me might know some of this. And so what I did is I did a whole bunch of pieces, and that magazine had the #1 sales of that year. And so from then on, I got tons of stuff. And Sunset, I did just about a whole book with them. And that was just on the side. I was incredibly busy with building, so we've done probably 500 building projects. And so it's just amazing that we did that. So it was, but I think it's been important, the vocabulary that's established by the architecture sometimes evolves. And even Mies van der Rohe did stuff like that. So it's not just me or somebody else. But thank you, Kate.
I'll just add to that. There was a class that Bruce Goff introduced when he arrived at OU, which was on landscape architecture and furniture, both. So he was really trying to extend students beyond just the building. And the students called it stumps and stools. Yeah.
We'd love to hear any more questions. Any stories? Yeah.
Since Donald mentioned me briefly. I worked for Donald for about, I don't know, probably 5 years, I think, late 70s into the early 80s. And I will say that, and Donald kind of touched on this, so a lot of the work that we did was urban. And there are very different constraints. But Donald consistently came up with these new models. We were doing this thing called, what we called it internally, he'd never heard it, the dog houses. And so what these were 20 by 20 foot houses, 2 stories, all open on the upper floor with a mezzanine and a kitchen. It was a great space, nicely windowed. 2 small bedrooms at the bottom. Donald figured that we wouldn't have anything larger than a 2 by 6 in that thing. The floors were framed by 2 by 6s. And with the siting in these, there's a lot of them out toward Octavia in the city here. And they're really good little urban solutions. I'd live in one, And so there was a lot of that. I mean, through the condominium period, 2 Worlds, which was that mixed use project that we did in the suburbs, which was pretty revolutionary. There was a lot of buy-in to make those things happen, but they're hugely successful. I lived in one. My friend over here ended up living in one as well. They were great spaces to live in, and they were a great bridge between. These were fairly small kind of, retail urban areas into neighborhoods, and they just made this great transition from the street to the neighborhoods, and they blended really well. It was a pretty remarkable 5 years. It really set my career. Anyway.
We might have time for one more. Okay.
Thank you for putting this exhibition together. Very interesting. Just a quick question. Why do you think the vernacular of this architecture has remained bespoke and hasn't necessarily caught on to a mainstream that we see today?
What do we think?
I can at least start with an answer. I think one piece of it is that this is not a style of architecture, it's an approach to architecture. And so I do think that there are still folks like our colleague Amy Levino that Stephanie mentioned earlier who are practicing in this vein. So similar approach, it's resourceful with materials, it's very client-driven, very site-driven, but the aesthetic has, it's not as sort of fanciful, but it's still there. And I also think that threaded across each of these projects, you'll see a different approach that, and it's shifted through time. And I hope you'll look up Amy's work too. It's called Official. That's the firm, the name of the firm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's it, is that it's an attitude, a way of thinking, not a style in the sense of style. And I think that that's its great strength, is that it's a values proposition. So, and that's certainly what I take from it.
I will, as we begin to conclude, add a couple more things. First is that the scholarship is ongoing, and we would love it if you would take some time and maybe kept learning about it. So if you follow this QR code, this is not a shameless plug, although it kind of is. You know, we'd love it if you looked at some of these amazing books and learn more about this fascinating group of architects. Lila, would you like to say something about your film, or is that too much? Just because while we're on the subject, you know, of learning more, ongoing scholarship.
Yeah, thank you. It was really wonderful presentation, and appreciate the call out, shout out. So I'm an architect. My name's Lila Cohen. I am the great niece of Herb Green, who is 95 and doing wonderful just over in Berkeley. So I started working on a film project several years ago that was trying to look back at the experience that Uncle Herb had. You know, he was 92 at the time, and I thought it was really important to capture and just document what he felt, what he thought, looking back. He accomplished so much, but his career was also cut short. He stopped working at 51 when he actually moved to the Bay Area in the early 1980s. So what was initially just an attempt to document my family member who I loved and really looked up to kind of turned into this full-blown feature-length documentary that took me across the United States, over to Hungary, and several years later, I'm trying to wrap it up by the end of this year. But that film really encompasses all these different layers that you kind of got a feeling for when you listen to a presentation like this. Is who were these people? What were they aspiring to do? What were the circumstances? And what happened to them? Did they disappear? Did the work disperse? Why didn't it flower into something that it maybe could have been? So it seeks to answer these different questions from a very personal perspective, being an architect, having gone through school, endured it, and just kind of getting an understanding of how else it can be. So it's been very challenging to go from architecture to filmmaking, but it's been exciting, and I really have appreciated a lot of the support from the colleagues here. And so fingers crossed, it'll be done by the end of this year. It's called Remembering the Future.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And let's thank our panel, Stephanie, Angela, Hans. Thank you so much for chatting about this. And thank you for coming here today. It really is so wonderful to see you all and to meet you all and chat with you all. Let's have a drink. Let's look at some work. I think the bar is open till 9. Is that right? Thank you again, folks.
I thought the conversation was great. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Stephanie, it's good to meet you. It's a pleasure. Hi, nice to meet you.